Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Wednesday, July 10th, and today we're going to be breaking down the news that just came out this morning that Kawhi Leonard is withdrawing from the 2024 Paris Olympics. He was with Team USA through the first few days of training camp, but as of this morning has decided that for health reasons, he is going to pull out. A replacement has already been named in Derrick White, so we're going to be breaking down all of that. Additionally, some basketball topics that we're going to be hitting on is the current status surrounding the trade market with Brandon Ingram, who has been shopped around pretty consistently during this offseason since the Pelicans decided that they were not going to give him the max extension, and it seems like not a lot of teams are biting. So I'm going to talk about what is the cause of that and what the Pelicans can do from here moving forward. Additionally, there was a very interesting case in free agency with Caleb Martin where he ended up losing out on $30 million after he initially rejected an offer from the Miami Heat and now is signing with the Philadelphia 76ers for a lot less money. A sneaky, very nice pickup for the Sixers, but I want to more so lean on the evaluation of what the Heat have done this offseason because it's been pretty quiet. Not some of that out of their control, but in large part, a team that just made the finals 2 years ago and seems to have lost a lot of momentum since then. So we're going to be diving into what their options are moving forward. And then in the final part of the show, we're going to be talking some MLB. We're going to start with some snubs from the All-Star game, and then additionally just sort of rounding out some of the biggest storylines in the MLB from yesterday's action. But before we get into all of that, just want to remind you to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. We try and make the show as interactive as possible, willing to answer whatever questions you may have. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can leave a tip or donation at the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a comment along with it, your comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Anything would be greatly appreciated there. I can't say it is the most surprising thing in the world that Kawhi Leonard is pulling out from these Olympics. This is something that has been at least in discussion for the past couple weeks, which is why they were so easily able to replace him with Derrick White, but it is definitely still a loss for Team USA, and it's a loss for Kawhi, absolutely, considering the fact that this was the first time he had ever been playing basketball on the national stage with Team USA, from World Cups to the Olympics, and he obviously is one of the defining players of this most recent generation from 2010s on, and it's unfortunate that we just keep coming back to this recurring theme of he just can't seem to stay healthy. Now, I will say in all of this, first off, just from the perspective of the Clippers with their fans, and after having this offseason of losing Paul George in free agency, it's probably for the best from an NBA standpoint of the Clippers and Kawhi Leonard that he isn't participating in these Paris Olympics because of the fact that he just missed the majority of the postseason this past year. Of course, he tried to return, but it was clear that he was just not healthy. That knee of his that he was dealing with inflammation was just not right. You could see, obviously, he was just sort of almost even scared to really try and be explosive. There's, of course, the clip that was going viral there of how long he was holding onto the rim after a dunk because he was scared to land. And considering all of that, it's obviously fun for all of us NBA fans to get to see our favorite players playing on this national stage, and it almost feels like because of the comments that the track and field runner Noah Lyles made, whenever that was, a summer or two ago, about the idea of the world champions and this NBA conversation and everything, that Team USA was really going out there, with all of the best players in the league. They were recruiting players, you could almost even argue, as well, such as Joel Embiid, who is initially from Cameroon, has French citizenship as well, and he was contemplating playing there. But they pulled out all the stops to build the best possible Team USA roster, and there was a very good argument that this year's Olympic team could be the best American team in international play history. Now, you can debate that in the comments section. That's not exactly where I want to go here. But, losing out on Kawhi Leonard is definitely a knock in terms of that argument because, player for player, Kawhi is one of the best that we have seen in recent NBA history. And again, for him, I feel like it's got to be a shame, as much as almost selfishly as more of an NBA fan first. Again, I do feel like this is the best decision for the sake of the Clippers, and frankly for the sake of his career probably as well, that he didn't need to put on these extra miles during these Olympic Games. But again, it's something that everybody takes a massive amount of pride in, and so you do have to feel for Kawhi a little bit. He tried to, make it work with the first few days of training camp, but his body just was not agreeing with him there. So again, very unfortunate there. As for what it means to the impact of Team USA, again, in a vacuum, he is easily one of the best players in the world when healthy, but they had Derrick White almost ready, considering the fact that they knew this was a very real possibility that Kawhi wasn't going to be able to play. And I do think that Derrick White is going to sort of seamlessly fit into this Team USA. Now, there's a chance that he doesn't even get real significant playing time, absolutely. But Derrick White is kind of the ultimate glue guy, and I understand, as we talk about this idea of talent and also the idea of, rest for some of these NBA stars who are going to be needed when the NBA season starts up again next year. A lot of people are upset with the fact that it wasn't a Jalen Brunson replacing Kawhi Leonard in terms of, this reserve spot. And again, if you're a Knicks fan, I totally understand. And some things are just bigger than winning an NBA in the NBA, where, there's the human aspect of this as well. And I'm sure that Jalen Brunson would have easily jumped at the opportunity to represent his country and try and go out and win a gold medal. It is one of the, all-time accomplishments an athlete can ask for. But in terms of Brunson, who was just especially down the stretch of the season for the Knicks, where we saw, of course, Julius Randle go down, and then the further we got into the playoffs, we saw Bogdanovich and Mitchell Robinson and all of his co-stars sort of dropping out of the mix. He was just asked to do so much, and we saw it physically taking a toll on him with his hand. He had that weird injury that popped up as well in the Indiana Pacers series, where I think ultimately they said it was his foot. Again, it was very strange, the circumstances that were behind that altogether, and he toughed it out and he played. But I think that having some months off of playing competitive basketball wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for him, just as it is with Kawhi Leonard. So, again, a lot of people just sort of get so upset about these debates, but, if you're a Knicks fan and you're clamoring for Jalen Brunson needs more respect, he should have been on this team, I think that just about everybody that consistently watches basketball respects and appreciates Jalen Brunson, that it's not a matter of that. When you're talking about putting together a 12, 15-man roster, not every player can be the superstar and that's why Drew Holiday consistently, when the U.S. tries to put together these rosters, Drew Holiday, and it's been spoken on before on behalf of the people who select these rosters, that Drew Holiday is consistently one of the first names that they put on because of the fact that he is able to have an impact without having the ball in his hands. And again, I'm not trying to disrespect Jalen Brunson by any means, but obviously his specialty in the NBA is being a primary ball handler and being able to, create for himself off of the dribble. He just doesn't necessarily look the same when you slot him into, a bench scorer role. And, that's obviously electric too, but you just have all these players who need the ball in their hands. I think that you can get away with having, supporting cast members that are really impactful of what they do. Not exactly the same thing, but I do feel like it is kind of interesting. You had Jared Dudley, former NBA veteran. I think he played 15 years in the league. He's currently an assistant coach with the Dallas Mavericks, and he was speaking on the upcoming Summer League. And he said, you are going to see players this summer in the Summer League average 25 points per game and never sniff any actual significant playing time in the NBA, and then you will see players averaging 5 points per game end up getting these contracts. And it's because, you need some of the unselfish players, and I'm not calling Brunson selfish by any means, but you see a lot of these players get rewarded for sort of doing the dirty work, the stuff that doesn't pop up on the stat sheet. And I think that that's what Derrick White does. And Derrick White gets results in terms of the box score as well. But if you consistently watch him, you see that his impact goes far beyond that. So you could list a good, 10 other players maybe, just off the top of my head, throwing out a number. And probably more, if we're being honest. Again, not something that I've thought too in depth about, but you can list a number of players that are American-born players that are better, flat out, than Derrick White. But at the same time, I think when you're putting together a roster, having some of these supporting cast members as opposed to the star power does go a long way. And I think that that's a little bit of what this example was. And I understand it's an honor for everybody that's involved. And again, there are some things that go beyond team success in a, national sports league, and that being able to represent your country on the highest level and earn those honors is something that, I'll never be able to sniff personally myself. And you can only imagine really how gratifying that is. But at the same time, again, I just feel like a little bit of extra rest for some of those star players. And again, I feel like Jalen Brunson has been the name that has been thrown out a lot in this circumstance. I understand. And Brunson, maybe, if you want to go that route as well, could probably, you'd have a good case that he should have made it over Tyrese Halliburton, who Halliburton's also a player who needs the ball in his hands a lot. So if that's the angle you want to go at, so be it. But again, I just don't think it's the end of the world for Jalen Brunson or the Knicks that he is going to have the opportunity to just actually, relax after having to be, an extremely high usage player for months on end, that he can just, physically recover and have an opportunity, because the Knicks, I think, are the biggest threat to the Celtics in the NBA next season. And, that's in large part off of the idea that Jalen Brunson is going to be healthy for them. So let me know how you feel in the comments section. Again, this is kind of a loaded conversation, but I think that ultimately Team USA probably got it right. And as for the stars of Kawhi and Brunson that aren't going to be playing in the Olympics, again, you have to feel bad for them, but at the same time, sometimes there are blessings in disguise, and I feel like that's the case for them. But we are going to be moving on to some basketball news more directly associated with the league itself. And I want to dive into the current status of the trade market with New Orleans Pelicans All-Star Brandon Ingram and where he currently stands in the trade market, because it's been pretty vocal that the Pelicans are looking to shop him, but nothing has really come of it yet up to this point. So we're going to be diving into that and what is next on that front. But first, we're going to be taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, no, this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, and we're now going to be moving on to talking about the state of Brandon Ingram and where he stands in the NBA right now, as he has been probably a name that has been thrown out to just about every team in terms of kicking the tires on whether or not he would be worth going after, and the Pelicans have gotten pretty much no response in return because of that. And it's in large part because of the fact that Ingram is on an expiring contract. He's headed into the final year of his current contract, and he has openly said that he is expecting big money from the Pelicans. He was hoping to receive a 4-year, $208 million max extension this offseason, and the Pelicans weren't willing to give him that. So they've been shopping him around, and we are seeing sort of the avenues of trade partners sort of closing. Now, the Sacramento Kings were a team that were reportedly in the mix for a bit there, but they instead decided to acquire DeMar DeRozan over this past weekend. The Atlanta Hawks were one of the top teams that were once thought of as a trade destination for Brandon Ingram, but an interesting report did come out within the past 48 hours or so that the Pelicans were trying to include Brandon Ingram in that deal when they made the trade for DeJounte Murray, but the Hawks were the ones that would not go for it. And it was because of two reasons: that Atlanta did not want to have to worry about giving him a big contract, and that they did not want to include Clint Capella in the deal. So, a couple things on this here. I think that Brandon Ingram could have been a potential, really good fit for Atlanta, but I also understand their reservations about it, because as we saw from the deal that they made, they sort of prioritized getting a younger player in Dyson Daniels, getting some future draft picks, and getting a big in Larry Nance Jr. that should look to be a pretty good pick and roll partner with Trae Young. And it seems like, at least to me, the Hawks are hoping to take a step back a little bit in terms of this idea of being instant contenders. I feel like their front office sort of got carried away after they made the conference finals in, I believe it was 2021, and they realized that they pushed all their chips in, traded all these draft assets to get DeJounte Murray to try and be this backcourt partner with him. And instead, it sort of resulted in just a middling team, because that's ultimately who they were. And I do feel like they benefited a lot from a little bit of, I wouldn't quite say an easy schedule, because they did still have to beat the 76ers. And Joel Embiid was actually mostly healthy during that series as well. So, they earned their way there. But I think that they sort of overachieved in that season, and it convinced the front office that they were closer than they actually were. So they're taking a little bit of a step back and hoping to, build around Trae Young. And Ingram could have potentially been a good fit and helped them immediately, but there's no guarantee that he can even stay healthy in this instance. And, just like everybody else, they are concerned about offering that much money to somebody that has an extensive history with injuries. He has missed 26% of the Pelicans games since he was acquired in that Anthony Davis trade ahead of the 2019-20 season. And he's only played at least 65 games once in his entire career, which was his rookie season, where also happened to be the year that he played the least minutes per game, the only time that he hasn't played 30 per game. So, what I will say is that with this type of a situation with Atlanta, as if they felt like Kawhi, or if they felt like Brandon Ingram was not somebody that would be worth the investment, I can understand sort of, not going for this deal. If it was about being too concerned about the idea of him stepping on the development path of Zachary Reese-Shea, who they just took first overall, I am less on board with that. I think that considering the reputation that was surrounding the 2024 NBA draft, getting Brandon Ingram would have been a pretty good price for that number one pick. But again, if they just didn't have faith in Ingram and had no interest in paying him, I can't necessarily blame them either. But the part about being unwilling to move off of Clint Capella is interesting to me because, first off, I would have liked to see him in New Orleans. I feel like that would have been a pretty good fit. But he did just shoot a career worst 63.8% at the rim this past year. He was over at least 71.5% throughout his entire stint of being a starter with the Houston Rockets for a number of years there. And it was a little bit of a significant decline, almost 10% worse from last season to this year. Now, they're clearly thinking that he can bounce back and that he is a good fit alongside with Trae Young. So, again, if they're looking to build around Trae, Capella is probably somebody as a lob threat. Now, Larry Nance does also sort of fit that role, I think, as a pick-and-roll lob threat for Trae, but, not a bad option to have multiple guys there that can play that style of basketball. And we don't know all the other details of what was in that package for if Capella was included in that, but I will say, DeJounte Murray and Clint Capella for Brandon Ingram, and we'll again don't know exactly what else was in there, but if those are the main cornerstones, that is overpaying a little bit for Brandon Ingram in my opinion. But it seems like Ingram isn't going to be moved this summer. Now, what does that mean for the Pelicans? On one hand, they get to hold on to a player that was legitimately in all-star conversations last year. Now, ultimately, he didn't make it. Games played were a part of that, but he's still a very good player, and his market isn't necessarily sky high right now, but that doesn't mean that he's not talented by any means. I think that people are too low on him right now because of the fact that he was not the best version of himself in the playoffs, but it was partially because, he had just missed practically the last 3 weeks with an injury, and that is, part of the problem with him, of course, but he was dealing with that. I believe it was his left knee that kept him out the last 3 weeks up until game 82, where he played but was on a minutes restriction, and he just never really looked like he was himself, and he definitely got worked in that playoff series against the Oklahoma City Thunder. But I would like to think that they would be in a really good position, moving forward here if it weren't for the fact that they only had one center. And again, that's why I would have liked the Capella fit in New Orleans, I think. But, their only center is Yves Missi, who I do like. They took him in the first round of this past draft. He played at Baylor last season as a freshman, and I do believe in him, but just frankly, he's not going to be able to hold his own against a Jokic or Towns or Anthony Davis in a playoff series. So they're going to have to address that need. In a perfect world, they trade Brandon Ingram for a center in return, but It doesn't look possible at this very moment. I think that they play out this season with Brandon Ingram on the roster. Ingram could be a big time, trade target at the deadline. The Lakers, Cavaliers, Heat are all teams that feel like they are in the realm of competing, but I don't think are necessarily quite there yet. And Brandon Ingram could be a piece that a team talks themselves into. If he can stay healthy, I mean, he is legitimately an all-star caliber player. So I think that is a very real possibility that he could be moved sometime, in next winter or so. But before we move on to our next segment here, we do have to address some comments real quickly from Kelsey. She says, I want Kawhi to play in the Olympics, but with his past, I guess I understand him focusing on the season. I'm pretty much, on the same board there. I think it would have been very cool to see him, playing for Team USA, because we've never gotten to see him on that type of a stage before. So it would have been a very fun, and you talk about just putting together, the Avengers of all of the biggest stars from the 2010s, and the fact that, Kawhi is a very prominent piece of that generation, and it's something that we're going to be missing out on. But, again, with his history of injuries, like you pointed to, I'm also sort of with it. Again, there are some things that are bigger than, an NBA regular season and I'm sure that winning the gold medal would be one of them to a lot of people, and I could understand that being the case. But again, maybe a little bit of a silver lining is the fact that he's going to have the opportunity to be healthier next year. So that's kind of where we stand with that. But we are going to be moving on to our next segment here. I did just mention that I think the Miami Heat could be a potential suitor for Brandon Ingram at the trade deadline. Now, as things currently stand, they are already over the luxury tax, but there are some things that could shake out next season that could potentially open up an avenue for them to cut some money and end up being rewarded with a player of Brandon Ingram's status. So I want to dive into all of that, but first we're going to be taking a quick break here. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, and as we just alluded to on the other side of the break, we're going to be moving on here into the Miami Heat's offseason, because overall it has been very quiet for them. The Heat, a team that just made the finals 2 years ago, and it feels like they have largely fallen into irrelevance since then. Now, Jimmy Butler has been dealing with a lot of injuries as well. That sort of takes away from what that Heat team has, but, at the same time, the Heat were a little bit of a mess last year, and ultimately they did make the 8 seed, and, maybe they would have stood a little bit more of a chance if Butler was playing. I mean, they also were missing Terry Rozier for that playoff series against the Celtics as well. I would have taken the Celtics over the Heat anyways, but that being said, I do feel like with some of those injuries and I think it would have taken a lot for them to just all of a sudden hop back into being really competitive, knowing that Rozier still hadn't really fully meshed in with the Heat. It was a slow start for him. He started to work his way back into, the identity of the Heat, but he was dealing with that neck injury that ended up keeping him out. And then Jimmy Butler, of course, with the knee injury that he suffered during the play-in tournament game. So I do think that now with a full training camp, with understanding what the current makeup of the roster is, if everybody's fully healthy, I do buy into what the Heat have more. Last year, their offense was really atrocious for a lot of the year, and that's why they went out to go get a Terry Rozier at the trade deadline. But you missed Jimmy Butler for a lot of the year. Terry Rozier, of course, like I just mentioned, wasn't even on the roster for the first half of the year, and then even when he came back, was dealing with injuries. And Tyler Hero as well missed a lot of last season. So you'd like to think that if they are all able to actually mesh with one another and stay healthy, that they could return to some level of prominence and relevancy again. I do want to, before we sort of dive into what the vision looks like entirely with the Heat moving forward, just talk about what has gone down so far in this offseason, because it's been pretty quiet for the most part. The loudest amount of noise that has come out so far was actually them being turned down by Caleb Martin in free agency. Now, this is something that, before we dive into it, I blame Miami in no way because of this. It was really an all-time modern bag fumble from Caleb Martin to let this slip away, because what the Heat had offered Martin was, they said, if you pick up your $7.1 million player option this offseason, we will then give you a 4-year contract extension after that worth $58 million. And when he declined the option, it took that offer off of the table because the Miami Heat didn't have the same flexibility as they did. It would have been a little bit cheaper in year one playing for $7.1 million, and then the bigger money would have kicked in. And Caleb Martin's camp seemed to think that they were going to get more money in the open market, and that just was not the case. So once Miami was off the table with that, $65 million offer in total between the player option and the $58 million extension, he ended up having to settle for a 4-year contract worth $32 million with the 76ers, which is over $30 million less than his offer in Miami. And for whatever it's worth as well, it's a little bit of a cliche, but in sports, but when you talk about Florida, you're talking about the no state taxes, and that is not going to be the case. So it probably ends up being more than $30 million when it all adds down to that. But again, Martin just definitely misplayed his hand here. Barry Jackson of the Miami Herald reported on the negotiation process, and he said that the decisions from Martin's camp left the Heat, quote, dumbfounded, and there really wasn't anything that the Heat could have done once Martin turned down their offer and declined that player option. They were unable to give him, that contract once again. So I don't want to get on the Heat's case for any of that. Caleb Martin did have a little bit of an interesting quote to kind of pile on to the weirdness of this story, where he was speaking to, a radio station, I believe it was, in Philadelphia, and he talked about how he signed with the 76ers because, quote, being a part of that winning culture and something bigger than yourself is something that draws you in. It's an interesting quote when you break it down, when you talk about, it's a little bit of a tough look for Heat culture, which has been, again, another one of those almost cliches, but there is some legitimacy to it as well in terms of the operation that Eric Spoelstra and Pat Riley run there in Miami. But it would be one thing if he signed somewhere where there was a little bit more of an established culture of winning. I just don't think that Philadelphia is that, this is the same organization that spent basically an entire decade. That's a little dramatic, but, the better part of the 2010s at least, trying to tank in order to acquire as much young talent as possible. And really, they only got one player out of it, after drafting Michael Carter-Williams and Jahlil Okafor and Nerlens Noel. Joel Embiid is the only one that actually panned out for them, so at least in terms of their early lottery draft picks. So just an interesting quote, I think, for Martin to put out there. Chances are he just had to say whatever he could to win over Philadelphia. But again, just a very strange series of transactions here. And, Martin, for whatever it's worth, is probably going to have a bigger role in Philadelphia than he would have in Miami. I think he's probably slated to be a starter. I would imagine it's going to be him, Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, Kelly Oubre, and Joel Embiid. And then, the rest of the rotation has been filled out a little bit with some of their offseason signings. Maybe some of their rookies, and Jared McCain and Adem Bona could end up playing for them. But, either way, Martin is probably in that starting lineup, and I think it's a good pickup for the 76ers. Obviously, when you talk about Caleb Martin and his biggest moments, you initially go to the 2023 Eastern Conference Finals, where he was incredible against the Boston Celtics and was the real X factor in all of that. So, Philly trying to overcome Boston, you feel like you maybe have a little bit of a Celtics killer there, but that will definitely, be determined as the season moves on here. But, for the Heat, as much as I do not blame them for what went down with Martin turning them down and ending up leaving in free agency, where does that leave them? Because the roster is mostly the same as it was last year, and they were an 8 seed, and for a lot of the regular season, didn't look good for them. Now, again, I mentioned the injuries that they were dealing with, and maybe the cohesiveness of, is that a word? Cohesiveness, cohesion? You know what I mean. Of the offense can look better next year with people actually getting playing time with one another, but it's mostly the same for them. Now, they drafted Kel'el Ware, who was excellent in his second Summer League game and has gotten a lot of Heat fans excited there. He could definitely be a rotation player for them. I'm really curious to see how he sort of fits in with that established group, whether or not we are going to be able to see some double big lineups with him and Bam Adebayo together. We'll see there. Second round draft pick of Pele Larson, who I liked when he was at Arizona. I'm not totally sold on whether or not he's an NBA player, but, we'll see. I thought it was pretty good value for them there, and I think they picked him at 44th. They signed Alec Burks in free agency. He had some moments as well a little bit when the Knicks were entirely, running on fumes in terms of injuries. Had some moments there at the end of the Indiana Pacers series in the second round, but other than that, again, the roster's pretty much the same, where you're talking about 3 guys I just mentioned. Not totally sure what their role is going to be with the Heat next season, if they're even going to get playing time, and they just sort of, their other moves are re-signing Haywood Highsmith, Kevin Love, and Thomas Bryant, who are all solid players as well. So I don't think the Heat are bad by any means, but did they really get better this offseason, coming off of a year that was definitely disappointing? And the Heat were handicapped financially for sure. Their current payroll is just over $170 million, which is the luxury tax. Now, it's not the first or second apron, but it is at least high enough that the ownership group is going to have to pay that luxury tax. And it's not like they could go out and sign anybody in free agency this past year. So I think that really for the Heat, the Jimmy Butler conversation is one of its own, and we've talked about it already this summer. He would have been moved already by now this summer if the Heat were going to really shake things up, I would have to imagine at least. So, Butler's going to be back, and you feel like with him and with Eric Spoelstra, you probably have a pretty good chance to be competitive. My biggest issue with them, though, is the fact that they have 5 players that will be making at least $19 million next season, and with only a couple of them do you feel great about the guaranteed production. It is Jimmy Butler, of course, Bam Adebayo, no-brainers there. Terry Rozier, who again I do have some belief in, and I think that year 2 he is going to fit in better in Miami. Then it's Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson. And I think that when you look at that, Robinson is at least only one more fully guaranteed season that if they needed to part ways with in, next summer, they could probably do so pretty well. Maybe they could, sell him off to a rebuilding team for a little bit of extra space at the deadline. But the Heat are going to need to get Tyler Hero off the books, I think. And his trade value is extremely low right now, so that was never really a possibility. If he can stay healthy through the first half of next year, I think that is definitely possible for him to build it back up. And you saw during the playoffs that maybe he does have a little bit of ability of being an improved playmaker that could help his value. But the issue was he was just an absolute turnstile on defense. The Celtics were possession after possession trying to attack him. And I don't know if you really have any faith in him being able to improve on that side of the ball. Now, let me know in the comments section whether or not you feel differently, but I think that Hero is probably the biggest detriment to that Heat roster right now. And if he can reemerge as a 6th man of the year and isn't a liability on defense, it's just so tough under this new luxury tax and the current CBA, the way that you are penalized so heavily for spending big. Because honestly, when they first gave Hero the contract, it was a lot for sure, but at the same time I didn't think it was crippling. But as the years go on here now, like $29 million allocated to him is a lot of money. And then under that, with that, you have to try and stay under the luxury tax thresholds. It's a lot to try and balance. And, having a player like Tyler Hero taking up just about 21% of your salary cap is a pretty big obstacle to overcome, in my opinion. But, the Heat are going to be at least in contention again next year. But there's also, as much as everybody talks about, the West is without a doubt deeper and overall I'd say is more talented than the East, but I think that people sort of throw that out there and overlook how many, very solid teams there are in the East, where when you talk about the hierarchy there, nobody ever really mentions the Indiana Pacers or the Orlando Magic or the Cleveland Cavaliers. It's probably going to be those same 8 teams you'd have to imagine next year that are going to be, in playoff positioning. And the Heat are just they're going to have to prove that they are better than these other teams, because I know it's been, really when you look at it calendar-wise, it's been just over a year since they were in the finals. But, ultimately, I think they have to reestablish themselves in a big way. But, again, let me know in the comments section how you feel on the state of the Miami Heat. But we're going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to start to dive into a little bit more MLB content, starting with the biggest snubs from the All-Star game that, we got the full rosters over the weekend, so we're going to be diving into all of that. So we will be right back with that. Don't go anywhere. Stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we move on here to some MLB conversations. Starting with the MLB All-Star Game, we got the entirety of the rosters on Sunday evening, and a lot of people were obviously, with your biases that comes into play here, upset about it. I do feel like the MLB got the majority of this right, so I don't have too many gripes. I was going through the list of different snubs, and I was pretty limited in terms of, how far I could go in terms of how many players deserve to be in the All-Star game. Now, very briefly here, I'll touch on this because I do think that it is a little bit of an important theme when you go through this list. Is I am not a fan of every team needs to have a representative in the All-Star game because, it's a little bit, participation trophy-ish, and I understand it's a tradition in baseball, and as baseball isn't, my number one most watched sport, I don't want to speak on something and have all of these, baseball kind of traditionalists at my throat, but I think that, it should really just be about who deserves the spot the most. And I understand that because the MLB hasn't necessarily been, top of the charts in terms of ratings the past couple years, I do understand the importance of trying to keep all 30 fan bases engaged. And that is sort of the idea that I do want to just float out there before we dive into these discussions is there are things that the MLB does in terms of the All-Star participants, and it, again, for me, it feels like partially, it should be judged objectively off of who deserves it the most. But the MLB is also in a state where they need to sort of manufacture a little bit more excitement. And you'll see very clearly why I bring this up. And that's because the biggest snub in my eyes is Christian Walker of the Arizona Diamondbacks, who has really good numbers all across the board. 265, 338, 507, hitting splits, a 138 OPS plus, 22 home runs, and 65 RBIs. He is having a very nice season, and I think that overall, it's not like the Diamondbacks are at the top of standings-wise. I mean, they're just under 500, and it's not like they deserve, extra amounts of attention, but this is a team that just made the World Series last year, and Walker wasn't even the best version of himself during that stretch, but I think that he's even, you can make an argument, taken a step forward this year, at least, to start off the season. Overall his numbers are better than they were last year. Now that's in a 92 game sample size over the one as opposed to the 157 that he played last year, but Christian Walker, I think, undoubtedly deserved this spot, but what was standing in his way is Pete Alonso. And, both of them playing first base in the National League. I definitely don't want to slander Alonso by any means. He is having a good season, and I think that because there's a very obvious conversation that goes to him being selected to the All-Star game, is that the MLB wanted him in the Home Run Derby. And he sort of insinuated the idea that he probably would not have participated in the Derby this year if he weren't actually selected as an All-Star, which, by the way, a pretty good move, I feel like, from his camp to float that out there, because he is in expiring contract and he's going to be a free agent this summer, and adding that all-star selection to his resume is definitely, who knows how much that actually, how much weight that actually pulls in contract negotiations. But, there could be something to it. I feel like there is a real factor of these teams wanting to say that they brought in an all-star from last year, again, for their own sake of generating a little bit of excitement. So, it's just kind of where it is with Alonso. Now, he could have done the Derby without the All-Star game, or without being an All-Star. It's happened in the past in the MLB, so it didn't have to be, we need him in because by rule, by MLB law, that's the only way to put him in the Derby. That wasn't the case. It was just kind of a power play from Alonso, and he understands his stature as he's been the Derby guy these past few years, won it 2 times, and I don't love it personally because, again, I do think it robs opportunities for other players. But at the same time, as we sort of move on here, I'm going to be a little bit hypocritical because we also saw the MLB maybe make a little bit of exceptions for some of the younger stars in Paul Skeens and Ellie De La Cruz. And it is a marketing thing for the MLB where I wouldn't say they're fully desperate, but there is a little bit of desperation for the MLB to have these, up-and-coming stars and getting eyes on these young players and trying to market them better, because I really don't think that the MLB has done a great job, at least in recent history, of marketing some of these young players. So, Paul Skeens, I fully stand by in terms of him making it. But again, that might be biased of me because I just love watching him pitch. And then if he's going to make an appearance in the All-Star game, I'm going to want to see it. And so that's where I understand I have a little bit of hypocrisy myself. I just don't know how many extra people are going to tune in for Pete Alonso and the Home Run Derby. But it's been clear that the Derby isn't exactly something that MLB stars are jumping at the opportunity to participate in. And that's something that I think behind closed doors, the MLB this offseason is going to have to try and work out. Right now, the winners get paid, but probably is going to have to become something where they incentivize even just participating in it. So, some people will argue that it's this big honor or whatnot, and I feel like I'm getting too far away here from the idea of the actual All-Stars, but, All-Star snubs, but, again, all of this to be said, Pete Alonso just does not really have a case for being more worthy of an All-Star selection than Walker in my eyes, because the only thing that he has over him right now is doubles, and I would have to double check the defensive statistics, but I can't imagine that Alonso is significantly better in any defensive metric than Christian Walker here. Let me know in the comments section if I'm off base there. Again, don't have those numbers directly in front of my eyes, but a part of this conversation as well is the fact that Alonso is the only representative for the Mets, and I think that there were other players that specifically I'll go to Francisco Lindor, and I touched on this a little bit earlier this week as well, so I won't spend too much time harping on it. But with Lindor, he is 3rd in the National League in total WAR according to Fangraphs. He is the only player in the top 12 that is not an All-Star. Now, part of that is because, of course, there is a lot of depth at the shortstop position in the National League, and it's a little bit why, when you go back to the Ellie De La Cruz conversation, where I think it's a real conversation between him and Ellie in terms of who is, more worthy of that All-Star selection. The nod was always going to go to the young up-and-coming player that seems to always get traction whenever a clip of him makes its rounds on social media, as opposed to Lindor. And it's not like the Mets are having, it would be one thing because the Mets are a big market, but if, as much as they've had this win streak as of late, not exactly a team that is viewed as must-watch outside of, Mets Nation. And, I think it's going to be fun if they can continue to go on this little bit of a tear here. But, again, it's complicated with the amount of depth that there is at the shortstop position. And that's also why Bryce Terang is another player that I think could have very much been worthy of a selection. But it's just that middle infield in the National League is just so loaded with the number of players that are there. And ultimately, when you talk about snubs too, it's interesting because we're going to have players opting out of playing in the All-Star game. Mookie Betts was selected. He is probably not going to be playing. We'll see whether or not Trey Turner is able to participate. I mean, he's been playing really well and he's healthy right now, but has still missed a lot of games this year, so it's a little bit of a question of whether or not he's going to want to take the rest. We just saw Rafael Devers in the American League already announced that he won't be participating in the All-Star game because he has a shoulder injury that has been nagging him a little bit and he wants to be able to take care of. But, again, I do think that for the most part, the MLB got this right. Now, there are some Orioles fans probably who feel like they should have a little bit more representation from some of their, field position players. I still think that Clay Holmes was probably the wrong decision there in terms of relievers. There are a couple players, Munoz of the Mariners, Jansen with the Red Sox, or Kimbrel of the Orioles. All of them maybe should have made it over Clay Holmes. But, let me know how you feel in the comments section. It's something that I'm choosing to not get overly upset about. But again, especially if you're a fan of one of those players that has sort of gotten bumped out because of ulterior reasons than just the results and how good they are on the field, I can understand your frustration and would love to hear about it because, I personally don't necessarily have those same perspectives. But we are going to be taking our final break here, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to be ending off the show, just sort of rounding out the MLB action from yesterday's games. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we're just going to be running through some of the biggest storylines from the MLB yesterday, starting with the fact that we have a new number one in the American League, as yesterday we saw the Cleveland Guardians overtake the Baltimore Orioles for the best record in the American League. So the Guardians got out to a hot start yesterday against the Detroit Tigers. They were facing Kenta Maeda, who has continued to just really be struggling for that Detroit staff lately. He got through just 2 2/3 innings. He allowed 7 hits, 1 walk, and 6 earned runs. So the Guardians quickly got out to a 7-3 lead there. But the Tigers did come back to make this thing interesting. Ben Lively ran into some trouble himself in the 6th inning with a couple long balls from Urshela and Malloy, and they actually ended up tying up the game, and this went into extra innings. So, the Guardians, a couple of consecutive close games that they had against the Tigers, sort of, you can make an argument, almost even got away with one on, what would it have been, Monday night, when the two teams played, where Mark Canha grounded the ball out to the shortstop, who just sort of overran the ball, and instead of turning a double play to end that 8th inning, they ended up scoring and breaking the 0-0 tie. That was the one run of the game. So, a couple close ones between Cleveland and Detroit the past couple days, but the Guardians were ultimately able to bring it home in the 10th inning, but it was scarier than it had to be. By the way, quickly here on the Guardians, just want to take a moment to give credit to Jose Ramirez, who has been incredible as of late, and I do feel like it's one of those weird things where you call somebody underrated for so long that the reputation almost turns that he's a little overrated. He's not overrated. He's really good, and now I think that people understand he's really good, but with everybody still calling him underrated, it's kind of setting him up for slander, and Ramirez was just unbelievable yesterday, and he's a great player, but 6 plate appearances, he singled, doubled, and then for the rest of the game, through his last 3 plate appearances, he was intentionally walked. So, I've been seeing some of the slander lately for J-Ram. If these MLB teams are going to respect him, you should too. But, the Guardians end up winning that game, and then on the other end, the Baltimore Orioles ended up getting blown out by the Cubs 9-2. And we see the Guardians, same amount of wins. They are now 57-33, but they take a half-game lead over the Orioles, who are now 57-34. And the Guardians are just a feel-good story to me. Now, if we're talking about, right here, who we're feeling better about down the second half of this season, I am easily going with the Orioles, of the team that I have more confidence in. But, this has just been a really impressive season for the Guardians, who, especially after Shane Bieber went down earlier this year, it felt like they were, kind of in for it, and that just has not been the case with their offensive explosion, and, represented by 4 hitters in the All-Star game. So, again, just a feel-good story there in Cleveland, and, they are in a prime position to be an actual postseason threat. So we will see there. But as we are looking at the top of the standings, looking at the National League, we had a matchup between the number 1 and number 2 teams in the Dodgers and the Phillies. Now, unfortunately, last night's game did not live up to expectations, as Bobby Miller, who was so much fun to watch during last season, his rookie year, the fact that he has just been deep on that struggle bus this year, where in this game, 4 innings pitched, 10 hits, 3 walks, and 9 earned runs, ended up giving up a grand slam in all of that as well. His ERA is now up to 8.07 this season, just a disaster, and he called it the worst start of his career. He's probably right there. I don't know what is going on with him in particular, but, with all of the Dodgers pitchers that are currently on the injured list, and just yesterday we saw, I think it was yesterday, that Tyler Glasnow is going to be placed on the 15-day IL because of a back injury. It would be really nice to see Miller step up, and that just has not been the case. On Glasnow, again, 15-day, don't think it should be anything, extremely concerning for Dodgers fans, but it just adds to a list of pitchers that have been banged up for them this year. And again, Bobby Miller, who was expected to be a bright spot on this pitching staff, has, really yet to show up in a big way for the Dodgers this year. But, the Dodgers kind of just punted on this game after it was 9-0. It was, again, just a little bit, you can say, emotionally charged, knowing that you were losing Glasnow and, falling into this deep hole so early on. But, they'll be on national TV again tonight on ESPN. I think that game probably tips off a little bit later. I'll double check that as we go on here, but it's just game 1 of the series. So, they are likely going to be able to bounce back. We will see whether or not they're able to. Game tonight is at 7 o'clock, so you can check that one out. Again, still the top 2 teams in the National League, but we'll just go rapid fire here on a couple of the other games from last night. The Yankees continue to slide. Last night they lose 5-3 to the Rays. Carlos Rodon has just been really struggling during the first innings of a lot of these outings, and last night that was the case again. The Yankees had briefly, gotten out to an early lead, 1-0 at the end of the top of the first, but it was pretty short-lived as the Rays put up 4 in the bottom of the inning. New All-Star Isaac Paredes ended up hitting I think it was a 3-run home run as well in that. So again, short-lived, but Ryan Pepio for the Rays ended up having, I would say, a pretty good outing overall. It was his longest in terms of pitches thrown throughout the course of the season. Now, he was dealing with some traffic, especially in that first inning, that didn't do him any favors in terms of, driving up that pitch count a little bit more. But he ended up having a pretty good start. And just briefly on that note, for the Rays, who are trying to find their way back into, some sort of contention here, also still at 500, and, you can't really expect that organization to be buyers necessarily at the trade deadline, but, we'll see where they go from here. And then staying in that division as well, the Boston Red Sox were able to pull out a win thanks to a massive second inning where they scored 8 runs. And, the entire offense was in on this game. Rafael Devers continues to stay red hot. Saw some of the others step up in a big way as well. Wilyer Abreu hitting a home run to sort of break out of at least potentially maybe his cold streak. So we will see whether or not that's something that we can, count on moving forward here. And then the last thing I want to just point out, stick around at around 3:30. Sam Menzie, of the host of the GSMC baseball podcast, he's gonna do a little bit of a deeper dive on Chris Sale, who's had an unbelievable season. I'm blanking off the top of my head. I don't have the numbers, but when we were looking at WAR earlier in the National League, I think Chris Sale is top 5, and you do always have a little bit of concern as to whether or not he's going to be able to stay healthy, but last night threw 100 pitches. Ultimately, it was 5 1/3, 5 hits, 3 walks. Did have 2 earned runs, but 9 strikeouts. I mean, what a redemption for him of being able to sort of hang in there and pitch with the best of them up to this point. So he's been, again, a massive revelation there for the Braves, who haven't had the same level of offensive production. Now, last night, they are able to get enough run support to help out Sale. They win the game 6-2 against the Diamondbacks, but that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content, and we will be back tomorrow afternoon, same time as always, 2:00 p.m. Eastern, and we will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.